All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to another Bible study of the Trimmed and Burning, or the book study, whatever you want to call it. We're in 2 Samuel, of course, telling God's word as one story through one family, and we are in the history books. One interesting thing I'll actually just point out here while we're in it today is here's the history books from Joshua to Esther. We are in 2 Samuel right now, and we're going to read 2 Samuel 10 today. But what's really interesting, and I should have maybe even covered this earlier, is 2 Samuel 10 is also 1 Chronicles 19. So sometimes in the Chronicles are the retelling of the kings in a new way. Sometimes you'll get a lot of similar material. Sometimes you'll get new material, all right? But some of the stuff that we're reading about now is actually happening in First Chronicles. Like I said today, First Chronicles 19 is almost an identical match. There might be some language change. Spelling of Shobach is like Shofak there or something like that. But so just to point out that the Chronicles, as we go through the kings, I'll probably start tying a little bit more into the Chronicles and kind of letting you guys know where they're at because they kind of tie in together. And then the Kings and the Chronicles, like I said, they're kind of their own story grouped together. After that is Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Those are the post-exilic books, meaning after the exile from Babylon. So those are a little bit different than those other books. But I just wanted to point that out. Technically, when we read 2 Samuel 10, you could actually read 1 Chronicles 19, and you'd be able to pretty much follow along almost, like I said, almost identically, which is pretty interesting. And people ask, why do they do that? Why do we keep that stuff in the Bible? Why are the Chronicles in the Bible if they just retell everything from the Kings? Well, it's from a different perspective, and like I said, you'll get different information. It's like, why do we need Matthew and Mark and Luke if we have the Gospel of John, right? Well, they all have their own benefits. They all have something they offer. The Chronicles are usually in a more positive light, pointing to Christ. So, like I said, when we get to David, like Bathsheba's, I think, next chapter in the 11, when we get to that, that's not in the Chronicles, because that's a negative light. The Chronicles are kind of written, David in a positive light, pointing to Christ. So that's just kind of the difference there. But I wanted to point that out. I wanted to do that the other time, and I forgot. So 1 Chronicles 19 is the same as 2 Samuel 10. Just want to point that out there. So just kind of reviewing, we're jumping all the way up to 2 Samuel 5. Remember, David was finally anointed king over everybody. It was his third anointing. And remember, he defeated the Jebusites that were in Jerusalem. They were the last group of people that had not been conquered. So it was crazy to think centuries went by and the Jebusites were still ruling. But remember, that's because Jerusalem's up on a hill. So it'd be literally, you have to go up this hill. You have to go up to fight. So it's a good defensive strategy. That's why the Jebusites probably lasted so long. Then King Hiram, remember, helped build David a house. So this is when we started to see that he's getting international recognition. And we still even see that kind of stuff today. Like, you know, it's really interesting. Like, you look at Israel right now. Some people recognize him as a nation. Some people don't. It was the same back then, right? So King Hiram's starting to say, we recognize you, David, as a king. We're starting to recognize you. And the international community, we're going to see, is going to start to grow and to recognizing David as a king. But they built him a house with all that nice wood there. It was some of the best you could find back then. So it was a really honorable thing for King Hiram to do, making a little bit of a peace treaty. Then the Lord helped defeat the Philistines. Remember, the Philistines attacked Jerusalem. Once they got it, the Philistines attacked. They're probably mad at David. They hated David anyway, but then David, you know, they had the whole thing where David lived with them, then was in their army, then they kicked him out, and then he's defeating them. So this is what happens again. He defeated the Philistines the first time. The second time they retreated and they attacked, and you'll see that's a pattern. We'll even see it today. That sometimes you defeat the enemy, but they would come back for more. They'd regroup and come back a second time. That's even what happened here. And David was able to defeat the Philistines a second time because of God, right? There was rustling at the tops of the trees, and that was a sign that the spiritual war was happening, and the Lord was going to win that one. Another reminder that the Lord's winning all the wars for him. Then, of course, we had the ark brought to Jerusalem. They screwed up. They put it on the cart because they knew the Philistines did it. It was easier technology. Let's just throw it in the car and roll it down the hill. It'd be a lot easier than carrying it. Made sense, except it didn't follow God's orders. And because of it, Uzzah died. He touches it. So not only did they take it on the cart, he also touched it. 2 fouls on the play right there. And Uzzah dies, and it's not good. And David's like, why did this happen? He was so frustrated, and it's because he didn't know his Bible. Although they didn't have the Bible like they do now. He didn't know the law of God and what it actually said. So even David, the king, was confused. And he's growing. He must have done a Bible study in between, because the next time he comes back and says, hey, guys, we got it wrong. We're supposed to carry it by 2 poles. It has to be the Kohathites. So David's done his research. And this time they bring it out with song and dance. They're able to actually bring the ark in. And then we also saw, of course, Michal get a little upset with him. Said he wasn't acting like a king, and she was judging his worship. But King David says, I can worship God, you know, the way I want to worship him. It's all for him, and God sees my heart. And then chapter 7, one of the most iconic chapters in the Bible, the Davidic covenant. Remember, he had his house built by King Hiram, and he's like, I have this awesome house, but God doesn't have a house. I should build God a house. And God says, whoa, David, I've never asked for a house in hundreds of years. Why do you think I need a house now? Why don't you think I would have asked all the prophets before you? He said, actually, I'm going to build you a house, David. And at first, that sounds crazy. Like, well, he already has a house. Why does he need 2 houses? No, this house is a dynastic house, a dynasty. He's going to build his house through his family, right? And that's what he promises right here. And that's what the Davidic covenant is. This is where we get the promise of Christ, who's going to rule forever and ever, a son of David. And this is why, from this chapter, is why you see Jesus called the son of David, which I love to go to Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. It's like Jesus, the son of Abraham, the son of David, or something like that. It's like, oh, that's interesting. He's not actually their son, but he is, right? He is through this house. And David is so excited. He thanks the Lord, prays a prayer of gratitude, so thankful. And he says, I wouldn't have been bold enough to pray for this if you wouldn't have told me these promises, God. So please bless me and thank you for all you do. And God, of course, starts to do it. And then we learned last week, 2 Samuel 8, now David starts to expand. He's expanding the kingdom. He's getting more and more victory from the north, the south, the east, and the west. Aram or Syria, Damascus, that's to the north. Philistines are down to the southwest. You got the Edomites to the southeast, and you got Moab to the southeast, and you even have the Ammonites to the east. So when it says that he defeated all those areas in that chapter, they're pointing out that he's defeated north, east, southwest, right? So he's winning in all directions. And not only that, he's expanding. The kingdom is growing because the Lord is blessing him. So that's what it's showing there. And even at administration, showing that a wise leader has a good group of administrators. They can train them to do the things, because to run a big government like this and to run a big kingdom, you need more than one person. It's a bigger job than just one guy. And it shows that David had the wisdom to train a good, strong administration with a bunch of strong leaders. You don't see that about King Saul anywhere. And then chapter 9, this is great. Basically a gospel chapter in the Old Testament, right? Because you got Mephibosheth, he's crippled, he's fallen, right? He's fallen, he literally fell and can no longer walk. He's helpless, right? That's how we are. We are fallen human beings, and we are helpless. And then what does David do? He goes and searches for Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth is hiding in exile, and he goes and searches for him, just like Christ searched for us. Then when he meets Mephibosheth, he says, Mephibosheth. First thing he does is calls him by name. The Lord calls us by name, right? And then because Mephibosheth says, I'm not worthy, just like us. Why? I'm a dead dog. Why would you love a dead dog like me? Why would you even care about me? It's kind of our response to Christ. Why would you save us? We're sinful, ugly people inside. And he says, no, you are not only, I'm not only going to not kill you, right? Because Mephibosheth had a death sentence. Think about, that's how we were. Death sentence for sin. Mephibosheth had a death sentence for being in the Saul's house. And he says, no, I'm not only going to not kill you, I'm going to restore you. Not only that, I'm going to call you one of my sons. You're going to be a king's family. You're going to sit at my table forever. It's exactly what Christ did for us. So you can see the whole gospel story, 2 Samuel chapter 9. And the beautiful thing again, and we're going to see this later today too when I preach later on, is that this is a little historical event. This literally happened. Mephibosheth literally came and literally sat at his table. However, God is so powerful and so good that he can take literal events and use them as types. So he oversaw, you can see God oversaw this whole thing because he orchestrated the gospel message. David probably had no idea how much of the gospel this played out to be what Christ did for us. He probably didn't know the full details, but Christ puts it in here for us so we could read it later, right? Just like we'll find out later on in Genesis, does the same thing. And now we're in 2 Samuel chapter 10. So let's go ahead and get our Bibles out. We'll jump into 2 Samuel chapter 10. We'll go verse by verse. This one's only got 19, I think, so it's a sort of shorter verse, or shorter chapter. And we'll read about what goes on here. It's going to be a lot more wars, of course, battles. There's a lot of battles that go on back then. All right, chapter 10, 2 Samuel chapter 10, verse 1. After this, the king of the Ammonites died, and Hanun his son reigned in his place. And David said, I will deal loyally with Hanun the son of Nahash, as his father dealt loyally with me. So David sent by his servants to console him concerning his father, and David's servants came into the land of the Ammonites. But the princes of the Ammonites said to Hanun their lord, do you think because David has sent comforters to you that he is honoring your father? Has not David sent his servants to you to search the city and to spy it out and to overthrow it? So Hanun took David's servants and shaved off half the beard of each and cut off their garments in the middle at their hips and sent them away. When it was told David, he sent to meet them, for the men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, remain at Jericho until your beards have grown, and then return. When the Ammonites saw that they had become a stench to David, the Ammonites sent and hired the Syrians of Beth Rahab and the Syrians of Zobah, 20,000 foot soldiers, and the king of Maacah with 1,000 men, and the men of Tob, 12,000 men. And when David heard of it, he sent Joab and all the host of the mighty men. And the Ammonites came out and drew up in battle array at the entrance of the gate. And the Syrians of Zobah and of Rahab and the men of Tob and Maacah were by themselves in the open country. When Joab saw that the battle was set against them, both in front and in the rear, he chose some of the best men of Israel and arrayed them against the Syrians. The rest of his men he put in charge of Abishai, his brother, and he arrayed them against the Ammonites. And he said, if the Syrians are too strong for me, then you shall help me. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will come and help you. Be of good courage, and let us be courageous for our people and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him. So Joab and the people who were with him drew near to battle against the Syrians, and they fled before him. And when the Ammonites saw that the Syrians fled, they likewise fled before Abishai and entered the city. Then Joab returned from fighting against the Ammonites and came to Jerusalem. But when the Syrians saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they gathered themselves together. And Hadadezer sent and brought out the Syrians who were beyond the Euphrates. They came to Helam, with Shobak, the commander of the army of Hadadezer, at their head. And when it was told David, he gathered all Israel together and crossed the Jordan and came to Helam. The Syrians arrayed themselves against David and fought with him. And the Syrians fled before Israel. And David killed of the Syrians the men of 700 chariots and 40,000 horsemen, and wounded Shobak, the commander of their army, so that he died there. And when all the kings who were servants of Hadadezer saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel and became subject to them. So the Syrians were afraid to save the Ammonites anymore. All right. A lot happens, again, in that chapter. First off, we'll start verse by verse. We'll look at the first 8 verses where Hanun follows really bad advice and he shames David's men. So you can see in the beginning, it starts out, after this, the king of the Ammonites died, and Hanun's son reigned in his place. And David said, I will deal loyally with Hanun, the son of Nahash, as his father dealt loyal with me. So David sent by his servants to console him concerning his father. And David's servants came into the land of the Ammonites. All right, so first off, it says, after this, the king of the Ammonites. What does it mean after this? Well, it means after David's military victories we read about. Remember? 2 Samuel chapter 8 and chapter 9. We're blessed enough to read this. So you guys, oh yeah, I remember that. That's why it's so hard if you jump into this chapter without having to study in 2 Samuel and say, after this, you just keep on moving. But you have to understand the context. So what has happened? Well, David is expanding, and he's conquering all of these nations, and now he has peace, right? Remember, now he has established peace, it says, which is why it's going to be interesting that we see all this war, right? He's just finally established peace. It's because he's kind of dominant, and he's expanded his kingdom. And this makes a transition for a time of peace now to conflict, when it says after these things. So it went from peace. So basically, after those peaceful times, when he was conquering everybody, it turned into conflict again. It's basically what that's saying there. Another thing to note is that the Ammonites, remember the Ammonites, if you go all the way back, where do the Ammonites come from? They come from Lot. If you remember that, they come from Lot's family. And which is interesting because Abraham and Lot, they were relatives and everything like that. But historically, the Ammonites have been enemies of Israel. And they're living there again to the southeast of Israel, to the east of Israel there, across from the Jordan River. Now you read here that Hanun's dad has died, right? And it says he is the son of Nahash. Now you can just kind of read that like, oh, it's kind of sad. This Ammonite king that David was friends with died. And you just kind of say, well, that's interesting. We'll go back to 1 Samuel chapter 11. Go back to 1 Samuel chapter 11. This is going to help us understand some things. And it's going to actually be more confusing at first, probably. 1 Samuel chapter 11. If I can get here. We'll just start out with the first 4 verses is all we really need to look at. 1 Samuel chapter 11. And look what this says. Then Nahash, there he is, the Ammonite, went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, make a treaty with us, and we will serve you. But Nahash the Ammonite said to them, on this condition, I will make a treaty with you that I gouge out all your right eyes, and thus bring disgrace on all Israel. The elders of Jabesh said to him, give us 7 days respite that we may send messengers through all the territory of Israel. Then if there is no one to save us, we will give ourselves up to you. When the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul, they reported the matter in the ears of the people, and all the people wept aloud. I don't know if you guys remember that story or not. But basically, Nahash comes in, and it's awful. Like, why would he gouge out their right eyes? Well, now they can't be archers. They lose depth perception, so they're not able to fight. They're basically crippled as far as war goes. But that's Nahash there. And this is the story that solidifies Saul's kingdom. Because remember, this is going to make a lot more sense to you guys. Remember at the end of 1 Samuel 31, and we learned that Saul and Jonathan died? Does anybody remember how that chapter actually ends? Anybody remember how that chapter ends? It says that Saul and Jonathan died, but then something happens to end that chapter. Does anybody remember? Beard.
Wasn't his warriors of Jabesh Gilead came Recovered their bodies?
Exactly. The member of Jabesh Gilead came and took down the bodies of Saul and Jonathan. Remember, like, wow, they have a really big loyalty. It was because of this event. Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, was waging war in Israel. Was going to make every man in Israel gouge their eye out and be a servant to him. And Saul, it says that the Spirit of God, if you go down further in that chapter, verse 6. Look at verse 6 right there. And the Spirit of God rushed upon Saul when he heard these words. And his anger was greatly kindled. And he goes, he cuts up an ox and says, we're going to go to war. And Saul, this is the war that Saul wins that solidifies his kingdom. Because before this, they didn't want Saul as king. Then Saul is made king after he defeats Nahash, the king of the Ammonites. So now go back to 2 Samuel chapter 10 where we're at. And now it's saying, David said, verse 2, I will deal loyally with Hanun, the son of Nahash. Look at this. As his father dealt loyally with me. What? Then is this not the same guy that was going to gouge everybody's eyes out? Yeah, it really was. So the best guess could have is if Nahash was going to gouge out the eyes and Saul came was a hero and fought him off. Remember when Saul was trying to chase David through all the hillside and the countryside and David was on the run? Remember, like, if, the enemy of my enemy is my friend? That's the situation I think that happened here. That David was the enemy of Saul, and Nahash said, I remember, he probably interacted with David at some point, like, hey, David, come over here. We got to get rid of that Saul, that king. I think he's evil too. You should be king, David. And I can imagine they made somewhat of an alliance at some point over time because Nahash hated Saul so much because that's how Saul rose to power. He ran him out. And that's why Jabesh Gilead was so loving of Saul, they went and got his dead body off. It's because Jabesh Gilead, all their guys would have had their eyes gouged out if it weren't for Saul that came and saved them. So that's why they had that love relationship with Saul, even though everybody else was like, Saul's a terrible king and was trying to kill David. But they respected him because who wouldn't? If somebody came and saved you from getting your eyes gouged out, I think you'd be pretty loyal to him for the rest of your life. So I don't blame Jabesh Gilead. But I think that's really interesting here. Unless you know that, you're just like, oh, that's cool. This Nahash must have been a pretty nice king. It's like, no, he wasn't. You got to read chapter 11 of the last book. No, he was not. So it's really interesting that David wants to deal nicely with this guy because he dealt nicely with him. So he must have had some kind of peace deal, I would imagine, while David's on the run there. But they probably made a treaty of some sort like that. But what David wants to do here is continue a good relationship with the Ammonites, which is really smart. If you're on friendly terms with the Ammonites, who are an enemy nation or another nation, you want to be on friendly terms. He's really political. David is not only a warrior, but he's also a really good diplomat, ambassador. He's really good politically. And he's saying, hey, his father died, and that doesn't guarantee anything. It's going to be a transition of power. I just want to let him know that I want to pass the baton of peace from his dad to him, to Hanun. So he sends his envoys, basically, to console Hanun, which is common practice back then. If you found out that a king died, you'd actually send envoys as a thing of respect and to show respect. So what David was doing was not abnormal. Like, what's going on here? Now look at verse 3. This is things go haywire here. But the princes of the Ammonites, which are basically his royal advisors, said to Hanun, their lord, do you think because David has sent comforters to you that he is honoring your father? Has not David sent his servants to you to search the city and to spy it out and overthrow it? So these are Hanun's royal advisors, his counselors, right? Because David even had his own. But they're suspicious of David. And they have no evidence, by the way. No evidence to be suspicious of David. They're more paranoid, you could say. And maybe because of what David has done after these things. Remember, he conquered all these nations, right? So they're all worried, even though David's never shown hostility to the Ammonites that we know of. And he's found out he had a peace deal with Nahash of some sort. But these counselors are so paranoid, and they're worried that maybe David's going to take over with no evidence. And you know how humans can do this. You can just see somebody like, oh, I wonder why they're here. Oh, I bet they're trying to do this. Oh, I should call my friend because I think they're, and it's like, this person just came for a burger. And they're at the same place, and you're like, oh, they're spying, and they're following because they know. And it can happen to you. You can give terrible advice or be in a terrible mindset because you don't have all the information, and you jump to conclusions with no evidence. But that's what Hanun's guys do here. And it shows that you need to seek a wise, godly counsel. Not all counsel is godly or wise. The advisors wrongly suspect David's men of being spies. They basically accuse him of he's spying you guys out, which he definitely wasn't. But Hanun's advisors essentially manipulate him because probably before this, Hanun was probably like, well, he was friends with my dad Nahash. He was cool. He probably saw him. You know what I mean? If he's friends with his dad and has a treaty, they're probably familiar. So at first he was probably like, oh, this is cool. And then he had his advisors tap on the shoulder. Hey, I wouldn't do that if I were you. They're spying on you. So be careful when you're just going about your business and somebody gives you warnings about somebody and about these things. Say, why? Why would you give me this counsel? What evidence do you have? Because Hanun should ask, what evidence? Did you hear somebody saying? Did you hear some warrior say they're going to kill us? No, I didn't hear that. Well, did you see anybody with spears out in their hands? Well, I didn't see that. It's like, well, then why would you tell me that, right? Sometimes you got to ask questions of these things when people get suspectful of others. Verse number 4. So Hanun took David's servants and shaved off half of their beard of each and cut off their garments in the middle at their hips and sent them away. So Hanun, unfortunately, follows terrible advice. And we can all do this. It probably sounded good to him at the time. Like, oh, you know what? Maybe they are spying. I didn't even think of that, guys. I wouldn't even thought that he was trying to spy because he was so nice to my dad. All right, let's go to war. That's a good point. I'm not going to allow this to happen. So he dishonors David's men by taking him captive and humiliating them, essentially, which was the way they're treated, by the way, is very similar to what slaves or captives would have been treated back then. So this is very, very dishonorable. And in the ancient Near East, back then, it was a very honorable thing to have your beard, and it was a symbol of honor and dignity, right? Not only that, it was forbidden to cut your beards like this. According to Jewish law, in Leviticus 19:27, it talks about how the beard needed to be shaped. Later on, we'll see how Mephibosheth let his beard go unkempt for a reason to show that he was out of sorts because of David. So you see here that it actually broke the law on top of everything else. Not only were they humiliated, it broke the law of the shaving of the beard that God had given them. And then, of course, I don't have to explain this to many of you, they got their garments cut off, like at their hip. So could you imagine just walking around with your t-shirt on and you're walking downtown and you have half your beard? Like, you look foolish, right? You look like a fool. You feel like a fool. And I'm sure it's basically public nudity, right? Public nudity is shameful, and it's actually a form of mockery back then. Thank the Lord they don't do that today, and it's illegal to do that. But back then, that's what they would do, parade you around naked and humiliate you. So that's what's going on right here. He follows the foolish advice, and it could have been, what's sad is it could have been probably a prosperous alliance. Hanun could have accepted it, and David and the Ammonites would have been friends to the end. They would have protected. They maybe would have fought wars together. It could have been great, but instead, following foolish advice brought an unnecessary war. And that's what can happen sometimes. If you're suspicious and you're in the wrong way, it can bring unnecessary conflict. It would have been another friendly situation. You can bring unnecessary conflict into it all. And that's exactly, I think, what's happened here. He could have, think about this. Hanun could have still taken the advice, but not caused a war. He could have said, thanks, guys. No, thanks. Appreciate it. You guys can head home, though. Really appreciate it. He could have just kicked them out of his house, kind of, in a nice, polite way and said, no, thank you. Really appreciate you guys coming here, but no thanks. Instead, he took it to the next level, right? Took it to the next level. It'd be like, could you imagine if a salesman came up to your door and he's like, hey, you need new windows? You're like, I just got my new windows 2 years ago. Do you need new windows? You can say, no, thank you. Go. But could you imagine if you ripped him in and shaved off his beard and then cut his clothes off? It's like, you didn't have to do that. Now you caused a bit of an issue. Now you guys probably have a problem, right? So similar situation. He didn't have to mistreat him even if he suspected him, but it was a terrible, terrible advice by his people, and it escalated the conflict. Verse number 5. When it was told David, he sent to meet them, for the men were greatly ashamed, and the king said, remain at Jericho until your beards have grown and then return. So you see here, David is a caring king. He's a king, and he's got a lot of important things to do. He just sent his ambassadors here, and he finds out what happened, and I love what it says there. It says, David, he sent to meet them. At first you can say he sent. So first you're like, oh, he sent some people to go see how they're doing. No, he sent to meet them. So David's actually going to meet them. He's going to meet them in the middle, basically. Hey, you guys come back. I'll meet you in Jericho. Because he ends up telling them to go back, to remain at Jericho until your beards have grown. So David meets them himself, which shows a really, caring king there. And you have to know that Jericho is a neighboring city, so it was not too far. But by having him there, remember, they had broken the law. It gives them time to restore their beards back so they're not breaking the law. And it also gives them time to heal before they return because, their shame, maybe they have to get over it, and it's a big psychological event. And it shows, sometimes when big things happen, you need time to heal. There's a big traumatic event in your life. You need time to deal with it, not just jump right back in. Like these guys, David could have said, hey, get back here. We have work to do. We got all these things. He said, no, take your time. I want you guys to deal with what you've been going through. He meets them, tells it's going to be okay. You guys just stay here. And when you guys are ready, when everything's growing back, you guys come back. So it shows here, David is very Christ-like because what does the Lord do? Think about this. That's why I love the gospel. It's all throughout the Old Testament. The Lord meets us where we're at, again. He comes to us, and he removes our shame. That's literally what the Bible says. He removes our shame. And that's what you see David here doing. Hey, you guys stay here. You don't have to be in your shame. We're going to remove your shame, grow your beards back, and you'll come back to the kingdom that way. Verse number 6 starts to get interesting. When the Ammonites saw that they had become a stench to David, the Ammonites sent and hired the Syrians of Beth Rahab and the Syrians of Zobah, 20,000 foot soldiers, and the king of Makkah, 1,000 men, and the men of Tob, 12,000 men. So the Ammonites realized they made a huge mistake. They become a stench to David means, That's not good. That means they'll kill you. There's a big war going on. They are enemies now, and they realized, oh, maybe they weren't trying to do that. But instead here, if I found out, like, oh no, I'm sorry, I really offended this person. Now they want to go to war with me. I didn't know you were actually trying to be nice. I really misunderstood that. I would be apologizing 100 times to this person. I really read the thing wrong. Instead, they double down. Isn't that crazy? They double down instead of repenting. Hey, sorry, we were wrong. Shouldn't have done. Instead, it says, you know what? Well, let's go to war then. Let's fight. And it's like, these guys are crazy. So they're picking wars, and it shows it's better. We're going to find out here. It's better to repent and cut your losses than continually go in and fight for your sins. That's what they're basically doing. The Ammonites are going to fight with David because they're going to try to justify cutting off their beards and their clothes and humiliating his people. It sounds like a silly thing, but they're showing their pride and defiance, which is very similar to humanity. We do the same thing with our sin, right? Sometimes people will, point out our sin and instead we'll double down and defend it. We'll defend why we did it, right? So, you got to be careful of this. This happened to Hanun and his people, the Ammonites. So what they essentially do here, what you're seeing is they're hiring mercenaries to help in the war with David. This was a thing back then. So it'd be like if America, I think Russia is doing this right now with North Korea. North Korean soldiers are fighting in Ukraine. Why? They're being paid. It's a job. They're paying North Korea money, Russia's sending them money, and they're coming and fighting. And that was a thing back then. And what you're doing is you're hiring the best professional fighters. So this would be like, somebody's picking a fight with Stonington Baptist. Now, we wouldn't fight them, but they pick a fight with us, and I go out there and spend all the money, and I go hire all the UFC. I go to Dana White and say, I want all your UFC fighters. How much? Oh, $3 million. All right, $3 million. We got it. Let's get some money together. Yep, and you hire, and now we're going to go to the brawl, and we have all these UFC fighters. That's what the Ammonites are trying to do. They're trying to buy warriors. They don't have them. They have some fighters, but they're like, even the Ammonites know, we're going to get routed if we fight David. We're going to need to call in the professionals, the mercenaries, the ones who do this full time, right? So that's who these Syrians are when they call them in. Verses 7 and 8. And when David heard of it, he sent Joab and all the host of the mighty men. And the Ammonites came out and drew up in battle array at the entrance of the gate. And the Syrians of Zobah and of Rahab and the men of Tob and Maacah were by themselves in the open country. So what happens here is David delegates the battle to Joab rather than leading himself. You're starting to see something different. Usually David would go out and lead it. He's going to delegate it to Joab. He trusts Joab, the commander of his army, and he's going to lead this. But it's a really tricky thing that's going on right here. And until you break this down, you might not understand. The Ammonites here, you can read, what did it say? The Ammonites came out and drew battle array at the entrance of the gate. So what that means is they positioned themselves at the city gates and using a fortified city as their defense. So they were basically staying here with a fortified wall behind them, a whole city back here, and they were standing out at the gate up on top. So they were defensive. It was a hard thing to go up and fight because they had a fortified city behind them. They could run, they could hide, they could do all kinds of stuff. So they had a little bit more of a fortified city behind them. Then you have the Syrians in the open field. That means on the opposite side, behind Israel. So if you're Joab and the Israelites, you're here, you're looking at the city of the Ammonites. They're up on this hill with their warriors, but behind you is all the mercenaries, all the professional fighters that they hired. So you're kind of, sandwiched here. You got the Ammonites in the front by the city gate and the Syrians in the open field behind them. And this is a strategic move by the Ammonites. That's why they came up in array. They actually had a pretty good military strategy, hoping they could trap and crush Israel from both sides. And perhaps the Syrians are the ones that came up with this plan. But whoever it was a military genius, it seems like. It's a pretty smart idea. And they should have probably had the upper hand. But then we go to verses 9 through 14 here as we continue on. When Joab saw the battle was set against him, both in front and in the rear, there it is, he chose some of the best men of Israel and arrayed them against the Syrians. So Joab recognizes the trap, but he doesn't panic. He comes up with a strategy. He says, you know what? I'll put all my elite warriors. Look, he's focusing on the Syrians first. Why? They're the pros. They're the best fighters. Forget the Ammonites. They hired these mercenaries. We got to worry about them first. I'm going to take my mighty men, my elite warriors, and we're going to fight the Syrian mercenaries. They're going to fight the professional fighters. Then what does 10 say? Verse 10. The rest of his men he put in the charge of Abishai. That's his brother. And he arrayed them against the Ammonites. So Joab trusts his brother to lead the other half of the army. Now Joab's delegating, like, hey, Abishai, you're going to use this one, but because I'm the head and I have all the elite warriors, you guys are going to fight the Ammonites because they're not as good. So he's teaming them up. It's kind of what we do at Upward at basketball. It's like, all right, this person's taller. It's match the tall one with the tall one, the short one with the short one. We don't want the short one playing against the tall guy and getting the rebounds. So it's the same thing here. He's matching them up. Joab is countering the attack here with strategy. So he has strategic delegation here. Have the strong fight the stronger and the weaker ones fight the weaker ones, essentially. Verse 11. And he said, if the Syrians are too strong for me, then you shall help me. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will come and help you. I love this. Mutual agreement and flexibility. Because how are things going to go? I don't know. maybe you'll be able to crush all the Ammonites and be able to help us, and we're going to slack. Or maybe we'll take care of the Syrians, but the Ammonites maybe will overstrength you. I don't know what's going to happen, Abishai, but whatever, let's agree to be there for each other, right? And again, the New Testament wasn't written, but they're living out Galatians 6:2. What does it say? Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. If your army over here is getting beat up, you've got to go help them, right? You got to help your brother out. And the same thing is with us in our spiritual battles. Hey, if you're going through a spiritual battle, I'm here to help you. But hey, if it gets too tough for me, can you come over and help me? Yeah, sure. That's what brothers and sisters in Christ are for. This exact same thing. If your life gets too tough, they can help you. If your life gets tough spiritually, they can help you in that spiritual battle through prayer and support and fellowship and things of that nature. Verse number 12. Be of good courage and let us be courageous for our people and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him. Basically, this echoes Joshua 1:9, right? Be strong and courageous, do not be frightened. Basically, what's happening here is Joab, I love it, is giving a pep talk. It's like before the halftime, before the game goes on, the coach gets everybody in the football team rowdied up, and everybody's like, hoo, 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 doing the things, everybody's slapping their helmets. That's what he's doing right here. He's like, we're fighting for God, and we're fighting for his people. He's reminding them who they're responsible for and why they're going out to fight, to energize them, right? And then we go down to verse 13 and 14. So Joab and the people who were with him drew near to battle against the Syrians, and they fled before him. And when the Ammonites saw that the Syrians fled, they likewise fled before Abishai and entered the city. Then Joab returned from fighting against the Ammonites and came to Jerusalem. So what's really interesting is here, he remembered that God is with him. See, may the Lord, remember what he said in verse 12, may the Lord do what seems good to him. Basically saying God's in control. Whatever God decides, let him decide, which is always the safest thing to do, by the way, right? Don't let me do it. God, whatever you think's the best. I want you to work out the situation because you're wiser than me. You're smarter than me. I want it to go this way, but you might know a better way. Go ahead and do it. Basically what Joab's saying. He's putting all of his faith in the Lord. And what happens here in verses 13 and 14? Joab goes on the offensive. He's like, let's charge at the Syrians. And they flee. Now this is really interesting. This would be like us, I think, in a battle charging UFC fighters. Some mercenaries, like I was saying, that people hired, and we charge them, and the UFC guys turn around and run from us. We'd be like, what's going on here? I think there's a sign here. Sometimes the Bible will say, and then the Lord caused a great panic and they fought against each other, or they caused a great panic and they fled. I think that's exactly what happened here. The Bible doesn't go to extra lengths to explain it. And we can read the text and kind of figure out, because does it make any sense that these mercenaries get hired, knowing who they're fighting against? They're probably supposed to have the upper hand over all these warriors. And the battle didn't even fight. They didn't even strike any. We don't see Joab struck somebody and then they fled. Like sometimes you see that in battle. It didn't happen. They just took off. I think it was divine. God, again, was winning the war. Just like you said, if the Lord, whatever pleases the Lord, and God led it like that. And so, what does it say there? The Ammonites saw that the Syrians fled. They likewise fled before. Well, imagine if you're fighting along UFC fighters and you're in this battle and you see the UFC fighters run down the alley, I'm running too, right? I'm taking off. If those guys are scared, I'm scared, right? So that's what happens here. That Joab going on the offense and the Lord rattling the Syrians to flee, the pros, the professional fighters, it also scared the Ammonites, and they ran. And what does this show? Sometimes it can happen to us too. We can be like the Ammonites. Who did they trust? They trusted the strength of men. Who did Joab trust? He's trusted the strength of God. We know this because the Ammonites ran when the Syrians left. So that was their strength. When the Syrians left, then we have no hope, right? Whereas our hope is an unseen God. He's there at all times, and that's what he just won this war, just like he won one for David against the Philistines a couple chapters ago. So we see that here. What's really amazing between, all of these things that went on here with this war with Mephibosheth or with Hanun. Hanun was offered kindness just like, think about Mephibosheth. That's where I was going with this. Last chapter, in chapter 9, David showed kindness to Mephibosheth. And what did Mephibosheth do? Oh, poor dead dog like me. Why would you do this? You're so great, David. I don't deserve this. He says, you can have a table with me. Then David immediately after this goes and shows kindness. Literally, after Mephibosheth goes right and shows kindness to Hanun. What does Hanun do? I don't want that. And he actually becomes hostile, right? So this shows that when God shows kindness to us, humanity, there's two ways you can do it. You can accept the kindness, which leads to peace and restoration with the Lord. That's us, when we accept Christ's forgiveness and all the nice things he's done. Or you can reject it, like an atheist would do. You can reject God's kindness. I don't need saved. I'll die for my own sins. Thank you very much. I've heard people say that, by the way. It's awful. That leads to hostility and war with God, just like it did with David. See how this plays out again? It's a gospel message. David comes, offers freedom. Mephibosheth accepts. He's forgiven and lives with him forever. God does the same thing for you. You accept it. You live with him forever and peace is restored. You deny God's kindness, you will be at war and hostility forever, and you will lose the battle. Just like how Hanun lost, you will eventually lose the battle if you would go against Christ's gospel and what it means for us. All right, let's finish up this chapter here, 15 through 19. But when the Syrians saw they had been defeated by Israel, they gathered themselves together, and Hadadezer sent and brought out the Syrians who were beyond the Euphrates. They came to Helam with Shobach, the commander of the army of Hadadezer, at their head. Some of you guys are saying, wait a minute, didn't Hadadezer get defeated in chapter 8? Yep, yes, he did. But remember what the strategy is, and the Syrians are doing this. These are the Syrians that just fled, and now they're coming back for more. Remember, this is what happens. I said, just like the Philistines. You defeat your enemy, they go, they retreat, they regroup, and they come back. And then you have to defeat them a second time. Same thing with their sin, by the way, right? Sin, you think you defeated a sin, something that you've really been fighting and struggling with, and you go a week or two and you're dominating, like, wow, Lord, thank you, I got the power. I think I've overcome this. Well, don't be surprised when that temptation comes in week number 3, right? And it attacks again. And you're like, oh, wait, Lord, I got it. It came back stronger than before. Lord, help me, right? That's what we're seeing that will happen. But Hadadezer didn't get killed in that first battle. He just got defeated. And now he's coming back because now he's getting people across from the Euphrates. Last time he wasn't beyond the Euphrates. Now he's getting guys across the Euphrates River to come and help. And he's now even getting Shobach, his commander of the army. So things have escalated. It's a serious war now. He's bringing his war general, and Hadadezer is going to fight back. And then verses 17 and 18. And when it was told David, he gathered all Israel together and crossed the Jordan and came to Helam. The Syrians arrayed themselves against David and fought with him. And the Syrians fled before Israel. And David killed the Syrians, 700 chariots, 40,000 men. And look at that. And wounded Shobach, the commander of the army, so that he died there. So David doesn't wait, and he goes on the offensive. David says, listen, I am going to fight in this battle. I didn't fight in the last one, but I'm coming to take care of it. It kind of reminds me, like, you know, when the kids tattle, like, Mom or Dad, this kid's doing this or whatever. It's like, hey, go tell him this. And you go and tell them, and it kind of gets said, and they come back and say, they're still doing it. Okay, I'm going. And then all of a sudden, you stand up from the table, and you walk back, and then you're going to handle it. That's how it is with David. All right, fine. Second time, now I'm going to take care of it, right? And that's exactly what David does. He leads the battle, and it's a lopsided war. Israel dominates, so it shows, again, the Lord is always with David here through all this, and Shobach is killed. The king of his army, his Abner. Remember when Abner died and Saul and then everything crumbled? Same thing here. Shobach is the leader of Hadadezer's army. And what this is showing, it symbolizes elimination of the enemy leadership. So now that he's done, it's almost like there's no longer a threat. It's almost been permanently dealt with, is kind of what this is getting at here. And God, again, has been with David and led him to victory. And then we look at the final verse, 19. And when all the kings who were servants of Hadadezer saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they made peace with Israel and became subject to them. So the Syrians were afraid to save the Ammonites anymore. So it kind of reminds me of, remember when Abner got killed, Saul got killed, then Abner dies, and then Israel's like, all right, David, fine, we'll join you. We'll join you, David. You can be our king. Same thing here. We're finding out here, the kings who were servants of Hadadezer was a powerful king, and he had other kings under him as servants. So he was like in control of other kingdoms, you would say, right? And they would be his allies and do whatever he said. When he got conquered, they said, all right, we'll do it for you, David. We're going to pay taxes to you. You're the king. You know, you're the guy. And they became subject to him instead. They were wise. They did what Hanun and his people should have done in the beginning. They should have said, you know what? We were wrong. We're sorry. Whatever you want, David. We shouldn't have ever done that, right? But instead, they don't. So these other kings were wiser than Hadadezer and Hanun because they actually gave in. They were probably shocked by the defeat because Hadadezer was a pretty powerful guy and a powerful king, which is why they were subject to him. He's a powerful guy, right? And that's how 2 Samuel 10 ends. Does anybody have any questions or comments based on any of those verses or things there? Yeah, Beard.
So when it talks about Joab and Abishai with the host of the mighty men, I didn't notice any numbers there. And when we do get the list of the mighty men, it's only like a couple dozen.
Yeah.
Like there's 30, there's 3, there's 50 or 60 names listed.
Yes.
We're obviously dealing with a much larger force than that. I'm curious, do we know what sort of force we're dealing with, and does it actually include all of the mightiest men, as well as like was this just the standing army that David maintained, and then later on it was the entire marshaling of all of Israel?
Right, it's a good question. We don't have all the details there per se. Obviously, we know it's probably more than just those men. It was probably those great mighty men, mighty warriors leading a charge, but we don't know the exact number of how many people. That is a good question. I don't think in 1 Chronicles 19, I think you get a little bit more numbers, but I think it might be more about the other armies than David's. I can't remember exactly the numbers there, but that's a really good question there. And we don't always have the full details. Sometimes they'll break down all the numbers, and sometimes they won't. But I'd imagine it was him and all those mighty men on the front, and then with some of the strongest troops, maybe not those mighty men, behind them there. And I think no matter if there would have been 10 of them, 300 of them, they would have wiped out those thousands no matter what. And that's why the reason it was a rout is because God God was with him. Any other questions or comments based on any of that? All right. Well, thank you again, everybody. Go ahead. You can read ahead next week for 2 Samuel chapter 11. We'll continue on. Until then, keep reading your Bibles and keep your lamps trimmed and burning.